Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Perez Art Museum, Miami. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and thank you for joining us for Local Views at PAMM with artist Cornelius Tulloch. Our virtual Local Views program is presented with the generous support of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation and features Miami-based artists sharing their practice and discussing works of art from PAMM's exhibition programs that connect in various ways to their own work. As a 21st century museum dedicated to representing the people and communities of South Florida, the Perez Art Museum Miami strives to be a leader in the presentation, study, interpretation, and care of international and modern contemporary art, while representing and cherishing the unique diversity of Miami-Dade. Through our exhibitions and programs, we aim to encourage everyone to see art as an incentive for genuine human interaction. Tonight, I am so happy to introduce Cornelius Tulloch, a Miami-based interdisciplinary artist and designer that explores existence between cultures, borders, and habitats. Cornelius is such a thoughtful and inspiring artist, and it is truly a pleasure to welcome him to Local Views today. Before I introduce Cornelius, I would like to acknowledge and thank the incredible team of people that work so very hard to help these programs come together online. Thank yous go out to Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult and Public Programs, and our world-class AV team, Denise Faxis and Andrew Bird. We could not do this without you. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Cornelius Tiller is a Miami-based interdisciplinary artist and designer. He graduated from Cornell University's School of Architecture as the recipient of the Charles Goodwin Sands Memorial Award for the top thesis of his graduating class. With work transcending the barriers of photography, fine art, and architecture, Cornelius focuses on how creative mediums can be combined to tell powerful stories. Whether it be through photography or painting, cinematic moments, and spatial complexity, all of these are depicted within his work. Lighting and color become characters in his work as well. His unique storytelling has been shown in fairs and museums such as the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C., Pulse Fair, Miami, Florida, and the Museo Nazionale dell'Arte de 21 Secola, Rome, Italy. That's a long one. From being recognized as a 2016 Presidential Scholar in the Arts and a 2022 Artist in Residence in the Everglades Fellow with ARI, to having his work added to the permanent collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem. Much of his success has come from the important discussions his work has created, which often are inspired by his cultural background. Being raised in Miami and gaining inspiration from both his Jamaican and African American heritage, his work expresses how bodies exist between cultures, borders, and habitats to create spatial impact. As you watch along this evening on Facebook or YouTube Live, please post questions for Cornelius in the comments section. He will try to answer as many as possible in the Q&A portion of this evening's presentation. And remember, if you value this and other programs presented by the museum, please consider supporting us by going to pamm.org/donate. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cornelius Tulloch to Local Views at PAMM.
Hello, thank you, Marie, for that introduction. And I'm glad to start now and share some more about my own practice as an artist here in Miami, but also, like Marie mentioned, sharing some of the artists who have been through the collection and exhibitions at PAMM who really have inspired the work that I do, and to see the context and how it influences my work as an interdisciplinary artist, focusing on how art can transcend boundaries, and also the narratives between landscapes and bodies and histories and cultures. And my name is Cornelius Tiller, and within this presentation, I will continue to talk about that transition between photography, fine art, and architecture, and how this really helps create these impactful stories. So shifting narratives of cultural identities, importance within the built environment by exploring how space shapes cultural identity, and how cultural identity cultivates landscapes. So this kind of transition between the two. And starting this presentation, I really thought it would be great to start with Ferrelli Baez and her work, the exhibition Bloodlines. And when this was in the Perez Art Museum, I got to really go through this installation and see, I think what she does well is blending culture in a way that is contemporary, but also acknowledges the deep histories of the cultures, with Ferrelli being a Dominican artist now based in New York, expanding her work from painting to sculpture. She really takes you into these storylines, allows the viewer to be taken and transported to these spaces through small details like icons, figures, adornment, ornamentation. In Bloodline, she really took the feminine form and allowed you to see it in a different light, to take portraiture and take it into this space of figure, object, allowing these bodies to not just present themselves as traditional portraits, but to make you think, to abstract you from the form, to really look at the cultural implications within her work. And I think the beauty for me and this exhibition of Bloodlines that Ferrelli had was like seeing also just the differences in scale, you know, as myself as an artist who works between different mediums and genres, I'm always looking at how do you take these ideas that you have on a tiny scale and explore them to the size of a structure, to the size of architecture and space, and how do you also remain authentic, you know, to these identities that you're speaking of, and to do a deep research into these cultures and spaces. And I think Ferrelli does an amazing job in that, as she kind of looks at the feminine form and looks at these histories of women in the Caribbean, and also just not the Caribbean as a space itself, but the idea that these landscapes are constantly in flux. These landscapes are in conversation with other regions, in conversation with the Western world, but also looking at Latin America's influence on the Caribbean, African influence on the Caribbean, and really seeing this idea of a Creole, of this idea that comes from the Caribbean, this idea of languages merging and people changing and new development of cultures and spaces. And Ferrelli really takes you into her process, allowing you to not just view it as a final product, but to see like this installation in the back, where you see these little elements taken from books, maps, and different geographical materials that are more research heavy focus, and overlaying them and juxtaposing them with her figures and different kind of flora and fauna from the region. So I think exhibitions like these of artists really help us understand place in this world, understand place and impact and all the contextual things that begin to layer up and create these very complex identities. And another exhibition from artists who really have inspired me are Christo and Jean-Claude, and seeing the exhibition Surrounded Islands, and this project that was from 1980, 1983 in Biscayne Bay, something that takes this idea of place, similar to Ferrelli, but really is inspired by the work. The work comes from whichever location where their work is. So Jean-Claude and Christo are both artists who have a lot of influence in their work, who many are familiar with and know, but I think the way that their work kind of makes you rethink the scale and the impact of art, but also not just art in the sense of making or putting a piece within this exhibition. I think it's really great that you get to see their process. You get to see the different sides of an artist, from the fact that they're doing these gigantic installations of these surrounded islands throughout Biscayne Bay with these kind of pink fabric and textiles and materials. But this was something that took a team, this one that took an idea. And what I love really about this duo is like how they explain their work in phases, in the idea that their work exists as software and hardware, a very process-driven way, where software is that phase of a project where you're really just building up an idea through drawings, renderings, sketches, letting the idea kind of build its own identity. And I think that's something that's very important in a practice. In my own practice is letting the project have that time to mature, that software phase, but also looking at that hardware period where it's like, oh, this work actually is coming to fruition, and seeing how the project begins to evolve, begins to adapt, begins to change. And I think what they do a great job of in their work is really involving the place, the region, as the work is inspired by these different locations and landmarks across the world, but this one specifically being a project in Miami, causing us to really pay attention to these islands, these man-made islands along Biscayne Bay, to see kind of this artificial placemaking within it and bring attention. So this project kind of expanded over 3 years. People came out to the beach and participated in the process. And what they were saying about their process is that in that software phase, they were able to build, the hype of their project and really get people involved. So seeing that as an artist, not only to bring a work to a place, but to be in conversation with people who are local, to really involve in that process. And I think the beauty of their kind of participatory phase in their work really helps you to see it in such a different light and see art making as a different type of process within itself. And that kind of leads me to this next artist, Zanele Muholi, who's a South African artist, photographer, but also sees themselves as a visual activist, someone who uses imagery in this way to speak about culture identity, race, gender, and all these different things with such kind of like layered and impactful imagery that, kind of looks really beautiful and daunting at the same time, allowing you in this specific piece with in Wagner, you can see this kind of conversation between the viewer and the actual subject in the art piece. But I think there's also this seductive quality where you begin to wonder, where is this person from? Who are they? And all these other aspects. But then what she says, and is important in her work, is that, she kind of looks at where does the power lie in representation, whether it's on the creator, the artist themselves, or is that power really held by the viewer? Because as you kind of investigate, you start to see that this layered image looks like it's very inspired by this cultural context and these certain things, but then you realize that these are everyday objects. These are everyday objects that she's using to create these kind of provocative portraits with this kind of artificial cultural importance. And it makes you think, well, how did I just then think of these things as these cultural objects? Why do I view them this way? What is that kind of storyline? And I think kind of giving that power to the viewer in your work and in portraiture, looking at kind of taking from the canon of painting to then create these kind of really mesmerizing photographs, really makes you as a viewer think and have that conversation with the artist's work. And I think this work kind of, in a sense, is this kind of radical self-portraiture that really transforms, these found objects and materials. And you really start to kind of see a historical context layered on the work within itself. But then you kind of see this kind of contemporary feel of this shift in portraiture, this shift in power with the work. So you see these elements of chiaroscuro with the lighting. And it's really just this kind of layered understanding that I think really has kind of inspired me in my work as an artist who works also and who came and started from a point, which I am going to kind of get into as we further inside the presentation. But this idea of portraiture as something that can really kind of shift ideas and concepts in the way that we kind of see ourselves, but also how the world perceives us. And that kind of takes me to my first kind of background. So as an artist, I started out with painting and drawing, very traditional mediums, but looking at portraiture, self-portraiture, as a way to express myself and also express my cultural identity. How do you take portraiture to that next level where you're not just looking at a figure, a person, or a place, but really thinking, well, who are they? Who are they beyond our ideas of race or skin or gender and these things, but looking at this kind of context of flora in of the region of the Caribbean, but also of the US. So kind of existing between these cultures that I do within, African American culture and also Jamaican culture, and taking these very important plants and things from both cultures and influencing them into the landscape, using the body as something to be ornamented, by these different influences. And in this kind of series, Caribbean Contemporary, I really look at this idea of developing a visual language that allows you to see painting as much more, portraiture, as much more than what the eye meets. You know, you really get a chance to delve into these scenes and think more of like, you know, what exactly am I viewing? Who is this person? What are these objects? You know, I think objects also within these two paintings, you know, it shares more context of who a person is. So these, in a sense, are portraits of people and places and all of plants found in the yard, all these things that really kind of give a sense of who I am or who people related to me are, that you begin to really explore that entire concept of portraiture. But my work, as I say, transcends into different mediums. So influencing this storyline from painting, but also into photography work. So within my photography work, you'll see a very similar narratives, this idea of space and place, of people and cultures and identities, and how landscape influence that. And in this series, Fruits of Our Mother's Labor, I kind of explore these notions of the Caribbean identity through these kind of small little portraits of fruits and plants that give you a different feeling. It feels almost religious in a sense in how these things are framed and posed and held, that you kind of get a softer context, or also pay attention to these everyday objects that you otherwise probably wouldn't. But my Genesis series is a series in which I began to document Black and Caribbean families throughout the pandemic, mostly my family members. But this idea, like we saw with Jean-Claude, of participation, of community, of building a project that not only, you know, is about your idea, but influences with, you know, other people, getting that context with it. So in this series, Genesis, I spent the time of the pandemic, those 2 years, really looking at my family and how our relationships were altered by the pandemic, and kind of looking at these ways of the Black domestic space as a space of rest, but also the space that we kind of really build our own cultural identities in, and upbuilding that way, and seeing the home as this kind of cultural space, of this space of cultural performance. So you see, as I mentioned, like this idea that lighting and color become characters in the work, in these kind of saturated scenes where you really begin to relook the home, but also in how I share my work. You know, the idea that photos and portraits hang in the home in a certain way. There's overlaid layers and ways that kind of mix kind of the traditional home framing, but also in this kind of contemporary way. And in my exhibition that I had for Genesis this past March, you know, I got to explore this idea of photography through installation, photography as an object, as something that discusses place and purpose and use of the home. So these kind of domestic things as the kind of iron grill door that goes to your porch or veranda, or curtains, in a way, as these kind of ephemeral architectures within our homes that open and close and have this movement and ebb and flow to them. So within that, I get to kind of explore these ideas of installation within my kind of photography work, and take it to another dimension where you're not just like looking at a photo, but you're being immersed into it spatially. And Genesis also kind of went to this public scale of the city where, you know, this series was kind of featured around Brickell downtown, and these spaces that really allowed you to kind of see this home space, this very intimate space on this public level. And what does that mean for a viewer to have this kind of intimate view into the Black domestic space on this kind of scale and level throughout Miami, and to see them kind of around was a great experience. And kind of as I kind of continue through installation, you know, seeing ways that our bodies, the viewer, can change. And in this kind of exhibition that's called Exchange that I did at Cornell, it was really a chance for me to collaborate with 3 other really amazing artists to build out this space where we can look at portraiture of a person and kind of dissect and segment to really collage. What is this identity on a university? What is this identity that we see in spaces as people are kind of forced by institutions or certain things to all coexist in the same space, but from different backgrounds? So within this next series that I'm showing, Rhythmic Landscapes and Patterns of Identity, I really got a chance to kind of explore this idea of landscape as portraiture with my family members, but also this idea that the landscape itself, you know, a portrait of a landscape, what does that look like? How do we begin to interact with space in this way? How do we begin to give space a feeling of human qualities So really sitting with these images and thinking, what are these colors and emotions that you feel when entering a landscape? As a photographer, I'm sitting in these spaces, hearing the environment, but now getting to experience that. And when I did the Erie residency, I kind of researched the Saltwater Railroad, which was basically the Underground Railroad, but going south into the Caribbean, where runaway slaves would then go, and maroons would kind of take place and leave through the Everglades to go to freedom or liberation. But looking at the space of the Everglades or this natural landscape as something that's living, that has culture, that has people moving through it. So this presence, using the light as that presence of a person, kind of going through these landscapes and really allowing us to reimagine space as something that's more lived, something more experienced. How do you convey those feelings and emotions out of a place? And with that, I really kind of took a different approach to the portraiture, the idea of portraiture, to then making portraits of landscapes and places. And I'm sharing also some work from an exhibition that I have upcoming on July 15th called Bougainvillea. But this series, and this is the first kind of public sneak peek of it, but this series where I worked with a designer, Diana Eusebio, to kind of build these kind of custom masks that talk to the Caribbean and this idea of dance hall, but also ornamenting and fashioning the Black form in place. But looking at this idea of dance hall, carnival, and these ideas kind of in a similar way with Zanele Muholi was like looking at portraiture of daily objects, but how do we look at daily fashion and how do we fashion our identities out of these objects and things and clothing? And in this exhibition, you will begin, and it's at the Faena Project Room on July 15th. You can really step into these spaces of the Caribbean and these storylines and narratives, but also looking at lighting and place and how I'm really taking installation to really not only look at images, but once you go to the actual gallery space, immerse yourself into these scenes, into these regions and places, and really have this kind of influence from it. So I think my interdisciplinary practice really transcends these spaces. I'm not only thinking about the final product of an image, but how do you feel when you're viewing it and actually within that space? And that was kind of a very quick introduction to my work, but also here my kind of social media channels, Instagram, but also my website and email.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cornelius. That was great. That was a really great, quick snapshot of your work. We certainly appreciate it. I know you just touched on it at the end, but I guess just from like following you personally, I know that fashion factors so much into like your personal life and your practice. Do you see yourself working toward, art and fashion, or art as fashion in the future in ways other than the one that you just shared? Could you just delve a little bit more into fashion in general?
Yes, I think one day I want to touch everything in terms of that's the interdisciplinary in me. Is like, let me test it all up. But I think fashion has always been important. I think it's a large aspect of who we are as people. Like I'm saying, this idea that we're fashioning our identities as people in this idea of place. So I think this was the first really stab at trying to really see fashion photography in a way that isn't this artistic and very thoughtful idea. But I think I definitely will expand more into fashion in different ways, and whether that's through costume or whatever. But really, putting that exhibition together really has just been mind-opening to really see where I can push the boundaries between these mediums.
Awesome, thank you. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you studied and how you got to using the mediums that you use today?
Yes. Okay. So I began here in Miami at Dash, Design Architecture Senior High. So that's where I really could see like, at Dash, you kind of take design courses and also art courses. So I never saw them as separate. I saw that I could bring my full self to design, my full self to art. And it really just showed me that like, it doesn't matter what the medium is, it's the message, it's the storyline between it. And then going to Cornell as an architecture school, people were always like, oh, you're the architect, you're the artist architect. And I was like, what do you mean by that? But seeing that I'm able to bring in these very authentic narratives and dialogues into a built space, into this really has been something that I'm like, okay, let me expand upon this, because I think sometimes we look at things as so separate, but it's all kind of building towards one way. And I think the more people who kind of embrace interdisciplinary ways of working or collaboration on any project, you're working with multiple people. So if we start to kind of build on that, we can really push the boundaries of the things we create.
Awesome. Thank you. And we do have a question from Samantha Torres on YouTube. I would love to know more about the choice of lighting in the Genesis series. Could you share a little bit more?
Yeah, so Genesis series, that lighting really started kind of as something just playing around with. I use red a lot in my photography and stuff, and that really started from that time in the pandemic where the outside world was this place of like caution, but also there was this like warmth to being at home, but also a fear of going outside. So playing with that kind of idea of red as something of caution, but also of warmth, and that kind of twofold dialogue of where we're also in our homes, but then also feeling trapped. And then the other colors kind of just emerged through playing around naturally and kind of just following artistic intuition with it. And I think as I kind of continue, I've always just gravitated towards red and oranges and warm colors, but then, contrasting them with blues and greens and kind of giving you an immersion into the space, and where my lighting in Genesis really started as this kind of red and blue context, but then it kind of, in my work, the lighting itself has also kind of changed, and now I'm playing around with pink tones and green tones, and really just seeing it emerge. And I think as I kind of continue, I'm seeing different ways to evoke emotion through lighting and really help kind of build on that.
Thank you. I think just before we close out, I know you shared the Faena project, but is there anything else that you're up to this summer that you want to share with everyone, or even just in general, like what you're up to these days, where you are in the world? Yeah.
Yes, up to a lot.
It seems like it.
The Faena project is that one's coming up, and it's really great. And then the artwork that I showed with the kind of different portraits of landscapes and stuff, that is now currently up at Soho Beach House. If anyone's interested in seeing it, and if you're a member, you can go and see it on the second floor. If you aren't, feel free to contact me, and I can kind of put you in and get inside of Soho House and really see that exhibition, where it's not only just photographs, but it's also a kind of artist track where you can listen to the sounds of the environments where I took the photographs, but also get this sense of place and what my practice is as an artist, where we also infused in music tracks from Jamaican dancehall music and also R&B and rap, and really talked about this cultural exchange that happens sonically, between spaces. And it really was great to see, the photography work, but also listen to this thing and see kind of, this continuation of blurring boundaries between mediums within that show. And those are kind of the two ongoing exhibitions that I have. And those kind of are really showing this kind of broad range of what I mean when I say interdisciplinary, because people are like, what does that mean? What do you,
yeah, what do you do? That big word.
So I think those help you kind of see the different avenues in which I'm going about my work.
Totally. Yeah. And I can attest that the work at Soho House is great and that it is truly interdisciplinary. So I highly recommend everybody go see it. And I just want to thank you so much for your time, Cornelius. It was really great to hear more from you and learn about your practice. And we thank you so much for sharing it with our audience. We can't wait to see what else you do next and to see the show at Faena. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was really great. Virtual class.
And thank you to the Perez Art Museum team also for inviting me.